It was my intention, when this composition was begun, to make an illustrated tract, so to speak. This idea was part of the inspiration for the composition. I intended to convey one simple idea, namely, that language, at least the American language, and in particular, the spoken and written language, joining these two, perhaps separable kinds of languages together, could, it seems, become obsolete, could be replaced in the mechanics of our daily life by other forms of communication, not more primitive or more essential, but in fact more complex, communicating matters and ideas that are derived from language, and that in some, if not all, instances are not only derived from, but concern themselves with the decay of the spoken language, such as in the popularization of a basically clinical notion, the person who stutters or falters in his speech not only reveals his anxieties about himself, but in fact creates the conditions in which new anxieties are brought into existence, projecting upon his environment, in effect, forces which cause that environment to take forms that seem to exclude the speaker, forms that cannot but substantiate the speaker's preconception, and that these newer modes of communication will be, paradoxically, more brutal and more dangerous, precisely because they will have derived from situations in which the instinctive resort to the language of rationalization has been thwarted. I will speak briefly, if there is time, of two typical situations. The first, a situation in which we may recognize the by now commonplace uselessness of language to assuage insult, when that insult is toward a moral principle. The second, the situation in which the spoken words have little or no meaning, being only part of a larger and more complex gesture. I will argue that in the first situation, the choice of language as the mode of communication is, in fact, part of the substance of the insult. That here, language is being used to underline, as if symbolically, the inapplicability of those moral principles. That the choice of language as a mode of communication is an act of insolence. With regard to the second type of situation, I will argue that, while, to be facetious, the act is more pure by having dispensed altogether with the spoken language, it signifies our acceptance of facts that are beyond the consequences of verbal thought, and that the seemingly increasing frequency of such facts in our lives is not evidence of some mystical transformation of our environment, but rather is simply evidence of the measurable effect upon that environment of the accumulation of instances in which words do not seem to suffice, where either we fail to recognize the misuse of verbal language and conditions that are acting upon us, and so fail to act upon this recognition, or, more perniciously, we misuse the language ourselves, advertently or through ignorance. In effect, the accumulation of those transitional situations causes a mutation in the environment that tends to produce pure, non-verbal facts. Paradoxically, it must follow that the purer the non-verbal fact, the less likely is the language to be able to cope with the situation that arises around that fact. For the sake of memorability, I will call the first type of situation the gun store misunderstanding. The second type of situation will be called the two puncher's error. I am not sure how these ideas came to be associated in my mind with the image of frogs. I suppose the reasons are not simple. I know that metaphorically, at a deeper level, the ideas are associated in my mind with the notion of age, that is to say, my age. I am now at the age when a man traditionally, I started to say instinctively, speaks first about his growing awareness of the phenomenon of age. He begins to speak of death, which is the consequence of age. I know that I have remembered, since I first encountered it, the author George Orwell's use of the image of frogs. I remember it, not distinctly at all, but strongly associated with nostalgia and death. On a more immediate level, I recall that the first composition of mine that I could be happy with used, by commission, the sound of frogs. Those very sounds of frogs that we hear now. And while I can recall the satisfaction of that time clearly, I recall, too, my awareness that I had entered the age of a continual preoccupation with death. You must be told, perhaps, that the composer in America comes to terms with himself rather late by traditional standards, and so that happiness and nostalgia are mixed. Finally, I have come to think of frogs as emblematic of that relationship that I barely understand between the mysteries of the transfer of life from one generation to the next and our irrevocable, necessary commitment to the use of nuclear energy. This association of images is ambiguous for me. I do not know how it started, nor whether I should trust it. I suspect that, like other preconceptions about biological facts, it defies explanation and can be stated only as an admitted bias for whatever facts there are to be discovered. That is, much as in the same way that coal miners reputedly take canary birds into the mines with them to warn them of the presence of toxic gases. The canary, being more susceptible to the poison, warns the miner by dying. I imagine that frogs will serve us in this nuclear age. Whether or not this notion is accurate is of no concern to me now. For me, because of this notion, the sound of a frog is especially significant. I intended to treat the sounds of this composition in a manner that symbolize those notions of mine that I associate with frogs. I chose as my material, or rather, I had as my material already, because it is a part of my whole relationship with frog sounds, a recording, Sounds of North American Frogs, published about 8 years ago by Foray Records Incorporated. The record was conceived, narrated, and documented with field recording by Charles M. Bogert, with the cooperation of the American Museum of Natural History. It is simply a series of 92 examples of frog sounds, grouped under the 7 headings that reflect the meaning of the record's subtitle, The Biological Significance of Voice in Frogs, with each example introduced briefly by Mr. Bogert. As I said, I intended to treat the sounds of this composition in a manner that symbolized those notions of mine that I associate with frogs. First, there would be the abundance of sound sources and the use of those sound sources in a symbolic manner. I'm not sure whether this has been accomplished. Aside from the traditional problem of whether art can be fashioned after the model of nature, the answer to which I am not presently interested in and am not concerned with illustrating, there is the more fundamental problem, again perhaps symbolic, of attempting to realize forms, the technical difficulties of which preclude any kind of certainty of the result. In this, I cannot be sure that I have not done to the frog sounds what I suspect and fear the irrevocable fact of nuclear development, whose consequences are perhaps equally beyond complete control, may do to the frogs themselves. Second, I wish to treat the sounds of the delivery of this text in a way that would be compatible with the environment of frog sound that you hear now. Here, of course, a significant choice has to be made. One can make the man's voice sound as much as possible like a man's voice, taking either the obvious solution of admitting the man's voice into the performance unmodified, or the more subtle way, based on an analysis of what one would assume to be the effect of the frog sound environment, in which one would attempt to heighten the listener's sense of the distinctly human qualities of the voice. Or one can choose to make the man's voice more frog-like. My choice was based upon an inclination to avoid the irony of contrasting the man's sound with the frog sound. The irony is irrelevant, perhaps more than irrelevant. It would certainly distract one's attention from a more pertinent contrast, that between the verbal nature of the text and the significant but non-verbal messages of the frog to one another. Further, I think there is a certain outdated mannerism in the glorification of such human qualities as the voice. The voice is perhaps not as glorious as we had reason to believe it to be when it was still the medium of thought. I think we know this fact instinctively, or should know it, and thus are less than persuaded, perhaps even offended, by the naive attempts in art to personify the voice without reference to the thoughts expressed. There is something of this in the typical dime store misunderstanding. I can describe, of course, only an intrinsically American event. I suspect, however, that it is occurring more and more frequently throughout the Western world. When you come right down to it, not much money changes hands in our everyday transactions. The business of maintaining our life and its necessities is so much a matter of small change that we recognize as one of the distinctions of being very rich the privilege of employing other persons to handle that business for us. In America, the type of store named the dime store thrived, or did thrive. I believe its function is being served now increasingly by what we know as the drugstore. But it thrives, or did thrive, on the business of supplying life's most insignificant necessities. The dime store in America is now in decline. And this decline is marked by, or accompanied by, a tendency, I believe, to employ persons of ambivalent morality. I do not mean thieves or other kinds of criminals. These, we would hope, are persons of a determined moral persuasion, however it may differ from our own. I mean persons whose morality about the simplest facts of the business of life has not matured. They are unsure in their role as salesperson about what is right and what is wrong, in their obligation to their employers and to the people of the public they serve. This uncertainty leaves them in a constant, unremitting state of anxiety, angst. I believe they are the mothers of our future, and their anxiety is more terrifying to me than death itself. I should understand their anxiety with compassion, but its consequences are, in my dreams, a threat to the future of our life here on earth. This anxiety makes man transparent to the energies of an ideal, while yet surrounding that ideal and protecting it, leaving it invulnerable to recrimination from the public. Typically, in the dime store enterprise, that ideal is to make a profit. Typically, the profit motive suggests the logic of excusing dishonesty. Traditionally, the consequences of dishonesty fall to the person who will profit from it. In the dime store misunderstanding, the inaccurate change of money is enacted by the salesperson, and the psychological consequences are his. But the profit goes to someone else, someone higher even than the manager, who militarizes the salespersons against you. Thus, one cannot argue against that misunderstanding event and expect to have affected the possibility of it happening again. Its consequences have been divorced from its motives. And those motives, thus, needing no rationalization, can exist apart from language. They have become as if a gesture, an attitude. They have become a fact that has no equivalent in the verbal world. I suggest that it is impossible for language, in turn, to render truly or persuasively the attitude of the person who, it is said, only does his job, when the products or duties of that job are in conflict with the welfare of mankind. I suggest that language is more than simply a bond between men. It is the only bond between men. It is the essence and manifestation of one man's love for another. For a man to see as his duty any activity that threatens the welfare of other men, he must first renounce language. I have presumed that, as in higher and more dreadful forms of cruelty, this dime store misunderstanding is a fact perpetuated by men for whom language has become obsolete, and that their residual speech, their very words, are a threat to us. This notion is not metaphysical for me. It has caused me to make this composition and to wish to leave with every listener some image, some token of my feeling. I hope thus, third, with regard to the treatment of the sounds of this work and my decision to find and use every possible symbol that would relate frogs in their humanly given nuclear future and man in his historically given non-verbal, should I say, post-verbal future, that through the use of these symbols, I might impart to the listener some of my concern over what I construe to be the generic relationship between the brutality of the two non-verbal situations I will describe and the effect of non-verbal facts or biological moral entities, whether they be frogs or men. Finally, I needed to resolve publicly my feeling that man must resist surrendering to the accumulation of non-verbal facts as an inevitable condition of life, in spite of the overwhelming odds in favor of that surrender. Odds that are daily flaunted for us in the hardening of language around incidents and situations that, were they to be subordinated to the time scale of the verbal world, explanation time perhaps would not exist. The non-verbal fact is characteristically brief. While it may be repeated at any interval, it seems to lack a time dimension. It has no duration. I believe that it originates in a predisposition to do physical injury to someone in the immediate area, someone almost within arm's reach. I believe that it is not profoundly psychological. On the contrary, I believe it differs generically from those states of personal tension, such as grief or anxiety or melancholy, whose dimensions are quintessentially verbal. Those deeper states are filled with words. The key puncher's error is superficial in the sense that it emanates from a regional psychology. It is as though from that environment. It communicates a passing state of being so brief and vital as to be wordless. It is, in essence, a fit. It is, neurasthenically, a spike of madness. It corresponds, perhaps, to the muscular movements of the frog. On this point, the metaphor cannot be defended. I have more to say, but there is not time.
about the encroachment of our competitors. We've got to do something. I mean, right now.
Why all the agitation, friend? Oh, take it easy, friend. I think you're just talking up a storm. Competition has a long way to go before it starts to hurt us. Come on, take it easy. Sit down. Oh, take it easy, friend. I think you're just talking up a storm. Competition has a long way to go before it starts to hurt us. Come on, sit down.
Quietly.
Well, competition has its story, and we've got ours. And from what I hear, competition has its story, and we've got ours. And from what I hear, our competition's got a... Take 3, rolling.
Yes, but thin as it is, they're telling our story.
And spoil our vacation plans? Come on.
Remember when you first saw the 66 Cadillac eating up miles on the test track at announcement time? Does this ring a familiar thing? The 66 Cadillac really takes it and delivers performance as no other competitive make car can.
You're right, of course. But they first showed us how this... You're right, of course. But they first showed us how the 66... They drive the car for 36,000 miles over the torturous test track. Oh, hold it. This is
Then they go over everything, starting with the engine compartment, opening and closing the hood, opening and closing the trunk, opening and closing the doors, opening and closing the windows. All right, let's see. This seems quite a retake. From the S are hairpin turns to high speed on the straightaway at turnpike speed and better. Yeah, I can. On and on in 8-hour shifts. Around the clock. Around the calendar. On and on in 8-hour shifts. Around the clock. Around the calendar. Turbo hydromatic takes it too, shifting through the... And a flick of the switch brings us quiet. You can almost hear. Listen, I can hear the clock tick. Hey, what an idea that is for a demonstration. I can hear the clock tick. Yes, here is a Cadillac to stand up and cheer about. This is what it says.
What a motor car. But look at this beautiful picture. As the most stately car on the American highway sweeps up to offer your customers the ultimate in driving comfort and pleasure.
The master musician Richard Wagner is a salesman, and called no musician at all. But here's a word. The master musician Richard Wagner is a salesman, and called no musician at all. The master musician Richard Wagner is assailed and called no musician at all. There is an old game called Follow the Leader. We knew it first as a boy's game, but it's a man's game too. And it is very, very old. It is as old as the world, and as old as the human passions. Envy, fear, greed, ambition, and the desire to surpass. Failing to equal or to excel, the follower seeks to depreciate and to destroy. And this is the penalty of leadership in every field of human endeavor. The master painter James McNeill Whistler is assailed and called a mountebank, but his genius is acknowledged still by all the world. They must not rest on those laurels, and they will not. And the master craftsman and the master salesman still hold their laurels earned through the years. They must not rest on those laurels, and they will not. Today, the leader is more and the master craftsman and the master salesman still hold their laurels earned through the years. They have challenged the leader, and they have challenged your leadership. For in the white light of publicity, you will never escape the penalties, nor will you escape the followers and detractors, for the imitators will remain on your heels. Let's do one more. For in the white light of publicity, you will never escape the penalties, nor will you escape the followers but detractors, for the imitators will remain on your heels.
After all, we both sold all of our Cadillac owners. We've only got those tough-to-close other make and 4-year-old Cadillac owners to close. It is announcement time.